Resilience is something that's talked about a lot today. A lot of times we don't define resilience. Be tougher for what? Like, what am I being tough for? People who are resilient actually are those who come back to their authentic original form. Confront the brutal facts of your current reality, but don't lose faith. And I think that's really important, because if you don't, you'll get blindsided.
Do you think that resilience is a gift or a curse? All right, we want to welcome you back to another episode of the New Rules podcast. It's your girl, Breezy, and I'm here with the man, the myth, the master of all things authenticity, Christopher Adrian Crawford.
Dog, the full government name? Wow.
We had to let the people know.
Wow, the full government.
He's a Christopher.
I am a Christopher.
How are you doing today?
I am doing well. I feel like as we're doing these podcasts, like our last one, it's been a long day, but we film at the end of the day, but it really is a highlight of my day. I can't wait to get to it. I think we got a really good episode today, so I'm excited to jump into the topic.
Yeah, everyone, thank you so much for listening to the podcast. This podcast is all about unlocking authenticity and empowering the authentic leader, because we believe that it leads to human flourishing. We do ask that if you listen to this podcast and if you love it, to please leave a review for us on your favorite podcast platform. Give us a follow on Instagram at Write New Rules, and connect with us on LinkedIn.
Yes.
But that's at Adrian Crawford.
At Adrian Crawford on LinkedIn. Make sure you holler at your boy.
Send us some love.
Let's do it.
Okay, so to start us off today, I need you to answer a question for me.
All right.
Do you think that resilience is a gift or a curse?
I actually think it's a gift. I think that life is difficult, and I think everyone can attest to that. It doesn't matter if you're incredibly wealthy, you have your own set of problems there. If you don't have a lot of money, you have your own set of problems. And so I think that those people who actually can build resilience, I believe it's one of the greatest gifts that we actually can have.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you define resilience?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that it's important, because I know resilience is something that's talked about a lot today in today's world, and especially from those who are older, who speak to the younger generation. They'll say, hey, they need to be more resilient. But a lot of times we don't define resilience. It's just be tougher, but tough. But I always say, for what? Like, what am I being tough for? Just to get through life? Just to, to have success? Like, what is it being for? And again, I kind of define resilience as this way, is that's an internal fortitude needed to bounce back to original form, like amidst external pressures. I think that when you look at the definition of resilience, it's kind of to come back to its original form. You think about a rubber band. When you stretch it, it comes back to its original form. I think people who are resilient actually are those who come back to their authentic original form. When something stretches them, when something challenges them, good or bad, they come back to original form. And I think that's an important distinction, because if not, what you'll just think resilience is just toughness. Just be tough and just get through something. But you can be tough and not return back to original form. You can be tough and get arrogant. You can be tough and then you can lose your confidence. So I think it's returning back to that original form.
Do you think that culturally, especially speaking in an American context, do you think that we do lack resilience?
I think so, because I think that we've lived in not reality. I think even the people who will talk a lot about resilience don't live in reality. Because remember, going back to your original form, I think when you live like this in a deceptive world, when you can just be on social, or you can think you're something that you're not, or always be trying to be something that you don't have the skill sets to be, I think it doesn't build that in us. I also think that because we live in a world where we have instant access to stuff, that doesn't ever really stretch you in moments. And so I think that we really do lack it. And I don't think it's just the younger generation. I think that across the board, I think we don't have resilience. I mean, you think about it. Think about Washington, D.C. right now. You know, we have the oldest house, I think the oldest Senate and House that we've ever had. And I see people up there who aren't resilient, you know, who don't have the fortitude to, well, they'll say one thing on a campaign trail or, man, I want to do bipartisan work. But as soon as they feel the pressure from other people in their party to vote a certain way, even though they may not feel that conviction or feel something different, they go that way. So it doesn't matter your age. I think it's just something we fully lack here in our country.
Can you give some examples of things that you've seen, whether that be individually or corporately, that show when someone or something is lacking resilience?
Yeah, I think one of the main things I think is kind of blame shifting, kind of playing like more of a victim mentality, to where you don't ever really hear them do any internal work of what they could have done wrong. Now, there are a lot of situations, there are situations to where, man, you weren't to blame. You know, it may have been 95% the other person or your boss or the company culture or that team culture. But there may be 5% of how you responded. But you never hear them actually do internal work. And so I think when I hear someone constantly blaming someone else consistently, I think that's one of those sure signs that I think they lack resilience, because what they're actually saying, you're not doing a deep enough dive to actually figure out, man, are there any things that you've done wrong? Because if there are things that you've done wrong, that will not allow you to return back to your original intent, you know, kind of to your original form. You'll kind of begin to morph a different way. So I think, you know, when I hear that, like blame shifting is one of them. I think another one is when you see people always kind of avoiding tough situations. And what I mean by that is, I'm not talking about toxic situations. I'm just talking about situations that people don't want to, they don't want to sit through. Like they don't want to, you know, like they're not willing to have a tough one-on-one tough conversation with somebody. Whenever there is a situation where maybe they get confronted by a direct report, or they get confronted by their boss or their manager, or there's a little bit of some uncertainty going on in the company. All of a sudden, the company, that the quarter out was a little bit lower than what they expected, and now everybody starts to freak out, and they're like, "Oh, now I got to go try to find a new job because I may get fired here." I think when you always see people not willing to ever stay in tough situations, I think those are two things. I think blame shifting and the reality of not wanting to stay kind of in a tough situation. I think a third one, when things are going good, when you start to see people always kind of talking about, I think when I hear people talk a ton about like who they are, like their accomplishments, I think that shows a lack of resilience. I think what that is that's a person that becomes inflated. Because remember, a lot of times we think of resilience when I talk about, or turn back to original form, we can think about like just bad stuff. But I think actually when things are up and to the right or going well, you can begin to be the person always talking about your accomplishments or what you're doing or how much money you made or how many sales you had or whatever it is. And then now all of a sudden you begin, I think, to start and you lead with those things all the time. I think that shows a lack of resilience, because when you know who you are, you don't have to tell people who you are. When you're good at what you do, you have to tell people you're good at what you do.
You mentioned avoiding tough situations. What really constitutes something as a tough situation that you should see through rather than just be like, you know what, I'm done?
Yeah, I think when you're new, let's just say you're new into the workforce and you're like at a junior level and you got to work long nights. And that may be a tough situation. I knew a few people who worked, they worked on Wall Street when they were fresh out of college, and they were working, sometimes they would work, 48 hours, they were like back to, all nights, and then they would go and, sleep for a few hours and go back. And that was just the rite of passage for like, kind of like junior analysts. But when I talked to them, some of them like stayed with it, others didn't. But when they felt like, man, they were willing to go through that because it taught them how to work. And again, I understand people have some different thoughts about that and say, oh, that's toxic. You got to, that creates, and it does. It has a negative side, because then you start seeing people that's when they can start getting addicted to energy drinks and Adderall and all type of stuff like that. But what I'm also trying to say is that I think that when there's tough situations where you have to work long hours at the beginning of your career, trying to build a career, I think that's something you should do. I think when you're starting off, you should be willing to stay in a situation that may demand more of you. Here's another, that may demand more of you than what you're getting paid. I think that's when you're learning, because I always think you may not be getting in your paycheck, but I do think that you may be getting FaceTime with your boss. You're around some older people and you're learning. You're learning industry tricks. You're learning. You're getting wisdom from people who've done it for a while when you're actually around more. So I think when we only make it monetary, that it's about the monetary gain I get. If I'm working this many hours, I need to do this. That's your choice, but I think people miss out. So that's one thing. I think staying in tough situations where you have to work a little bit harder early on is really important.
So how do you know that something is a right thing for you to do without the main determining factor being comfortability?
Well, I think that you have to, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, I think you have to know kind of what values you have, right? Mm-hmm. So if you have a value of, say, family, and what I mean by that, it's that value for you, and what it means for you is, you want to make sure you're at every one of your kids' practices, and you want to make sure you're at all their events and plays and all that. Nothing's wrong with that at all. Well, then, being in an environment that's maybe having you work 9 to 9, 5 days a week may not be the right environment for you because it violates a value of yours. I think those are ways. I think you have to have values. What are the things that matter the most to you? And I think that if they line up with your values, I think you can stick them out. I mean, that's the one simple thing. I think if they violate your values, I think you don't. I think you always let your values guide you. So that's a very simple way, I think, in deciding if something's good for you, or, if it's good for you or it's not good for you. Because I will tell you that anything that you do want to do, and I would also say, the values, but also where are you really trying to move and where are you trying to go? What's the plan for you? I mean, you may want to move up the corporate America ladder. I know today I feel like that's an evil thing to say, that if somebody wants to move up and have success, that they don't have work-life balance. They are, they're addicted to work. Whatever. And I'm like, well, what if it's not? What if somebody just actually they want to have some success. They want to be at a higher level, so they want to create better culture. They want to get a higher level because, you know what? Maybe they're trying to create generational wealth. They want to get to a higher level because they want to create more jobs and maybe more access for people who look like them or whatever it may be. If that's the case, then I think that if somebody is like that, then that may be a value there. So then they're going to have to be in some different situation than somebody else where that's not a value of theirs or desire of theirs. So I think you need to have values in your scoreboard.
So you just explained a little bit about the importance of having a scoreboard for your life so that you can always revert back to the priorities, the main things.
Yep.
That's the easy part. I feel like, in my opinion, if you have that, it's easier than the process of trying to figure out what that scoreboard is.
Yep.
I think that a lot of people think that they know what that is for them, and it's actually being guided by, so many other unconscious principles, such as we work with a lot of people, and as we dig into their past with them, we find out you're doing this to prove to your mom this thing, or to your dad this thing, or to this one person who got onto you one time this thing. What would be your advice to people who are kind of on that journey, and especially what would be your advice to people who think that they've arrived, because you're never really done with that?
I think that we always say that's why it's important to do a lot of the internal work. It's to be able to ask, what are the motives, to try to figure out what's driving you. Do you have a chip on your shoulder? That's one that people talk a lot about, right? If you have a chip on your shoulder, you hear about that a lot in athletics. Man, the guy had a chip on his shoulder. That's what drove him. And I think that's a good motivator. I think there's energy around that. But here's the negative. The one thing about having a chip on your shoulder is that chip will keep driving you to where you're never satisfied. Because it's okay, once you now have that thing, then it's just not enough. You get there and you're dissatisfied. because you're chasing something and you're trying to do it because you'll never prove, like, whatever that is. If it's a coach who said something to you, if the parent said something to you, teacher said something negative to you, whatever, like, you're never going to prove that person wrong. And so you'll keep chasing. So I think that becomes a negative. So I think you have to really dive in and, like, check your motives. Like, why, to ask yourself consistently, I know we talk about that a lot. Why are you doing this? Why are you pushing the way that you push? Why do you want to have success? Why do you want to be in this role? Here's another one. Why don't you want to be in a role? You know, because that's the other thing. It's the fear of what happens if you fail, and who would I disappoint? Maybe it's the idea that you know, you have you actually want to do that, but maybe at home, you know, your spouse grew up with a father who worked all the time. So she now has a response to that where, man, like, she's really pushing on you, even though you want to really push forward, but they think something different. And so now, instead of you having a real conversation with your spouse about what you're really doing and why you're doing it, you just kind of like just cave in. And eventually that's fine at the beginning. It looks like, man, you're a family person, you're a family woman, you're a family man, all that. But eventually you'll get bitter. Because what you've done is that things that are inside of you to go chase, you didn't go chase because you weren't willing to do that. And you weren't willing to confront your spouse about, man, hey, I understand where you come from, but now you're projecting on me pain from your past. So I think all those things you got to really begin to look at. We talk about a lot, man, your family of origin is huge. You know, what are some milestone big moments that really defined you in your life? You go back and look at those, you can start seeing some of the motives and intent that are kind of there.
What do you think is the difference between being resilient as a quality that you kind of embody for your entire life and being resilient through crisis?
Well, I think that resilience in times of crisis are it's you're facing a lot of, like, pressure than normal in, like, kind of a condensed time frame. So in those moments, you don't have time to process everything. You don't have time to process every bit of how this moment is kind of, like, hitting you. You know, I've had to lead through sometimes through crisis and helping people, leading CEOs through crisis. And it's kind of like being in, you know, and again, I don't want to make this hyper, but it's like being, you know, it's in a battle, and all of a sudden you don't have time to stop and do full-fledged surgery. Sometimes you have to just kind of just bandage yourself up the best you can to manage to keep moving forward. So I think that's important, that you're going to sometimes need it's a lot more pressure in those like tough moments of crisis. Like, it's a lot more pressure. And what you have to lean on in those moments is, I always try to tell people, one of the ways you get resilience, you don't start forming, like, worldviews and ideologies in a storm, in a crisis. Like, what you went into that storm and crisis with, that's what you hold on to as far as how you view the world, how you handle situations, how you deal with people. And then afterwards, you do the autopsy of the situation. And then that's been where you learn from there. I think overall in life, when you're just thinking about having this general resilience, I think it's kind of like, you know, you think about a sprint versus a long run. It's like, man, I think you have to pace yourself. I think that's why you're constantly doing a lot of internal work. I think to build resilience in the long term, I think you should try to do something tough. You know, you try to, like, implement that in your life, like something tough. Like, you try to, you know, I've been doing, you know, like, you know, cold plunge stuff, right? And working out more. And why am I doing that? Just because, again, yes, health and all that, but it's, man, doing something I don't want to do. Like, you know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter. Everybody talks about, man, eventually, like, you fall in love with the cold plunge. I'm like, dude, every time I'm in there, I think it's freaking horrible, right? But it's just like, no, but I do it because it's something tough to do, or whatever that may be. I think that's how you build resilience long term, by doing tougher things. I think you build it long term by ourselves. We talk about having your values, having things like that. I think being able to, like I said earlier, go back, autopsy situations where you had tough moments of crisis. I think you can learn tools and things that happen in those moments that can build resilience in there. Because you need when you come out of a crisis and you're looking for long-term resilience, you got to see where crisis stretched you. Did it stretch you? Did it inflate you or deflate you? And you got to look at that in that moment as well to be able to get yourself back to original form.
So for those who might be in a moment of crisis or those who are trying to grow in resilience, what is the first step that they can take?
Yeah, the first step you have to take, I think, process reality. You have to face the brutal facts of your current reality. It's a famous statement that's made from the book Good to Great years ago, that confront the brutal facts of your current reality, but don't lose faith. You got to face reality. I think especially in today's world, we easily have the ability to detach and to disassociate with feelings, emotions, moments. And I think you have to lean in. You can't put rose-colored glasses on a situation when you're in it. You got to just say, no, this is the real reality of it. And I think that's really important, because if you don't, you'll get blindsided because you're looking at it. And if you go into it thinking, oh, no, it's not as bad, or, oh, hey, if we just do this, or, man, if we just look at it from this positive view, you won't see it for what it is, and then be able to give the proper response to it. So I think that most people try to go in situations, they either overinflate something, or they make it, or they underinflate. They make it not to be that big of a deal. And I think that you have to be able to look at that in the eyes. And then here's the truth about it: it's painful. It's painful as a leader if you're leading in a moment to where all of a sudden you have to let people go. And then on top of that, you start having to deal with employee issues. And then on top of that, as a leader, it seems like everything comes at once. And then all of a sudden you're dealing at home where one of your children isn't doing well. And then you get some negative backlash on social media. Then you get, all that's happening. And so what you have to do is be able to face that and look at it and in real time, deal with, okay, hey, here's what's in front of me. How do I address this? Make sure you have a quick moment to see what's actually going on inside of you. What is it making you feel? When your response to the situation, are you leading out of fear? Is anxiety driving you, or are you really driven from being in a non-anxious place? So I think you've got to face reality. It's the most important thing at the beginning.
When people are processing reality, typically they do that for about, maybe 5 minutes, a very short amount of time, and then they kind of jump into an action plan. Like, well, what do I need to do now? What do I need to do now? Especially in crisis.
Yep.
But you actually think that there's something that you're supposed to do before you define the scoreboard, which is a little bit more about the priorities and the steps that you're going to take for what's next. What is the middle?
Yeah, I think that once you get to a point of being able to process reality, I think the next thing is that you got to be in the moment. We talked about you got to practice presence. You have to be able to look at a situation and deal with whatever situation's in front of you. That's what you're dealing with right now. There is somebody I know that was in a pretty difficult car accident. And honestly, the person should have, from all everybody said, should have died. But because the reason why he didn't, and the reason why they did a surgery that most people don't really ever get, because most people die from the injuries he had, was because of he was able to be calm in the moment. And he was able to be present. There was, even though it was a horrific crash, he was able to just be calm and keep his heart rate down and do certain things. And that sounds crazy, but what it was that he was just in the moment. And, because in those moments you can start thinking about, oh man, am I going to die? Or, man, what if I would have done this? Or that, you start thinking about, and that creates the anxiety that pushes stuff. I think the same thing we can learn in crisis is that what we can learn in crisis moments are that that we need to make sure that we're being right there, focusing in on what's in front of us. So if you're dealing with a situation to where, man, you've got to let someone go. Let's say you're a manager and you now got to fire a couple people. That's a crisis, right? Nobody likes to fire anyone. And so if you're doing that, what you have to do in that moment is to be able to sit there, calm down, not start thinking about what's their reaction going to be, not thinking about, oh man, what are people going to think about you? Are the rest of the employees going to begin to now question everything? Are we, is the company okay? What you have to do is think about, man, I've got to deliver some news to some people that's going to impact their families, going to impact their life. And so because I'm doing that, I need to be right here, and I need to be able to think about, man, being present, how would I want someone to help me? how would I want someone to deliver this news to me? Because what it'll allow you to do, it'll allow you to then to be aware. It'll allow you to have wisdom. It will allow you to be able to, if there's a curveball in the middle of it, you're going to be able to react to it because you're right there and you're in the moment. And I think a lot of people in crisis start thinking about the future. They start thinking about, and that starts to drive their anxiety. And what we always say about that, anxiety speeds you up. Anxiety kills creativity. Anxiety, it kills empathy. It kills all the stuff. And so that is why in crisis moment, you have to look at every situation. You may be dealing with 5 of them. You have to look at each one of those situations and deal with them one-on-one. And I would say on the other side of it is that when you're not only in crisis, but when we are talking about resilience, it's not just only the good stuff, the bad stuff. It's like, man, what all of a sudden, if you got 5 incredible things going on, same thing. How am I addressing this? Because what you can do, if you start looking at the future of everything else, you can get out of alignment and start to become inflated. You begin to now think, you begin to overestimate your skill set, your ability, the ability of the company to actually lead during this time, the ability of your organization. You're like, man, we got a bunch of momentum. You're like, but what if we did this? I see it a lot. I mean, I work with other leaders in other spaces, nonprofits, churches, and, you see some pastors, all of a sudden they get momentum. And now it's like, man, if we go here, we're going to get here. But their staff, their people, they're not there yet. All they're thinking about is the future. What if it does this versus realizing where they're at right now? Or they could have fear of their future. And if they have fear of their future, then they won't push because they're like, well, the bottom's going to fall out, so we can't do that. So it's like, no. Be in the moment, allows you to evaluate your resources, see what you have, and then you can address it from there.
What do you think is the difference between being able to look forward and kind of predict what might happen so you can predict how you're going to respond now, and a little bit more of the visionary aspects, especially of you, versus just doing that to not be present in the moment?
Yeah, I think I think the difference is that when you start thinking about the future, it's to start becoming aware of your body. And so that sounds different, but it's to be aware what's going on inside of you when you start thinking about the future. When you are in a moment and you're trying to do that, or what's happening? Are you getting what emotions are happening in you? Is it hopeful? Is it excited? Is it fearful? Is it what's going on? Because that will determine thinking about and balancing it. Because then if you can recognize that, you can then begin to ask yourself, okay, why am I anxious right now? Why am I fearful right now? Why am I excited right now? Because even the excitement part may be, oh no, because your gut is telling you, oh no, this is a good thing. So I think that's when you think about it, be aware of what's going on in your body, be aware of what you're feeling, because now you can quickly look at that and say, if all of a sudden I got fear, it's like, well, why do I have that? Okay, well, now if I'm about to make this decision, because now your plan, you start really, if you're not aware of your feelings and your feelings are all fear, then you're going to build this safe plan that may not be the right plan because you need to be a little bit more aggressive. So I think you have to be able to be aware of what's happening in your body in that moment.
How do you typically handle crisis?
It's very strange for me. When I get in crisis mode, it's like the best way I tell people the words I use is I drop down. And what I mean by I drop down, it's I feel like my body sinks down and I just become very stoic. I'm not super high. And you know me, I'm very high, I'm very low. I become very just it's weird. I become very calm. I think part of it is because I have for a while so much internal crisis that I think when external crises happen, external crises aren't as wild.
Finally, something else to pay attention to.
It's not as wild as the internal crisis, so I think it's not as freaky. And so what I do in those moments, I drop down, and then what I really do, and a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is kind of I try, when I'm giving thoughts about stuff, I try to communicate things that that I've evaluated from my own life that I feel have been helpful versus I read this in this book. And I think you can read, and I think that stuff is helpful. Listen to podcasts you listen to this one, and it can be helpful. But what I try to do is give stuff that I've actually done. And it really is that. I mean, I try to drop in the moment and say, okay, this is reality. This is the hardcore reality of the situation. Then I try to look at, okay, what's going on? What do I have in my hands? What needs to be addressed first? I try to step it out. Okay, we got to address this. Who are the key players in this? Who needs to say this? Who can handle some on something else. I give very clear directives to those people to do that. But then I also run it through the grid of like, man, where's this pushing us forward to? Where's this pushing us away from? So that's kind of what I do. And honestly, what happens is later, I'm like a delayed reactor to like crisis. Like it's kind of like 6 months later, I'm the guy like, oh yeah, that happened. Like, you know what I'm saying? But I think it's just kind of some of it too. I think it's just the way that like, yeah, I just have been wired. So I tell people I'm way more like of a wartime person than I actually am a peacetime person.
Mm-hmm. Would you consider yourself to have always been a resilient person, or is that something that developed later in your life?
That's a really good question. I would have given you a different answer a few years ago. I would have said that I wasn't resilient at all. Now that I look on it, because I actually know what resilience is. See, I grew up where resilience was just about, man, just be mentally tough. So that was normal. Like, if you got emotions or feelings, put those in a box. And you're like, well, does that, I'm like, that doesn't really make you like resilient. That's a part of it, but that doesn't fully make you resilient, because I started looking, I'm like, man, the level of suffering and hardship that I went through, like to build when I played sports, like just the ability to get through the workouts we would do. And like, I was doing extra stuff and all that, the ability to growing up in a tough city and being able to survive in that, and good and bad. There's parts of it where that tough parts where I got scared about things shaped me in some bad ways, some are good ways. So I would say it's like half and half. I think I was kind of like, I'm somewhat resilient. I was somewhat not. It made me think about this recently with my son, because the more I watch him, I wouldn't have said and this is why this is important to get the right view of resilience, because for a long time I would say he wasn't resilient. But when I look back on it now, I'm like, oh no, he's a pretty resilient kid. Like he's faced a lot of difficult things internally and externally, but like he's still like, you still see a lot of who he is come out, and he's willing to keep going. He doesn't stop. He didn't quit. He didn't just say, well, this is just my lot in life. He kept going. I watch him when he's, being on, spectrum, and his hand development was like one of the last things he did, to get. So, he's, 10, 11, 12 years old and still having trouble tying his shoes because of like his finger strength. But watching him now play basketball, he shouldn't be able to do the things he's able to do because of how weak his hands actually were. And how long it took for those things to develop. But I'm watching him now, and as I watch him now, it's like, man, he really has like come a long way, but he just stuck with it and got through some stuff and kind of remained. So it's actually pretty cool to see. So I think, to answer your question, yeah, I think I was like half and half probably. I would have said no for the longest, but now I would say half and half, because I think I've redefined it, and I think that's what resilience is.